The baby cries his eyes out every time he sees his grandmother. His mother discovers why and immediately calls the police. Hello, everyone. Enjoy these moments of relaxation by watching the story of Andy. Andy, a 3-year-old boy, was running through the house with a radiant smile, dragging a red toy truck behind him. His joyful laughter brought a smile to the face of Sarah, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen. The peaceful scene was suddenly interrupted by a cold and authoritarian voice coming from the entrance. "Andy, come here and see your grandmother," said Margaret, his stern grandmother, her piercing gaze fixed on the little boy. Andy immediately stopped laughing, his eyes filled with fear. He backed away, clutching his truck tightly, his voice trembling, "Mommy, Mommy." Sarah, hearing her mother-in-law's voice, quickly wiped her hands on her apron and came out. "Oh, Mother, you're here. Would you like some tea?" she asked, trying to keep her tone calm despite the worry in her eyes. "No need. I came to see if the little one has made any progress. Children like him need strict discipline. We can't let them become spoiled," Margaret replied, in a dry and authoritarian tone. Sarah glanced at Andy. The little boy's eyes were red, his body trembling. "Andy, go say hello to your grandmother," she said softly, though her heart was heavy. Andy shook his head vigorously, tears streaming down his face. "No, I don't want to," he cried, running to cling to the legs of James, his father, who had just come out of his office. "What's going on?" James asked, looking at his wife and then his mother. "Your son has no manners. He needs to be taught," Margaret said in a stern tone, her gaze filled with disapproval. "He's just a child, Mother. Maybe he needs more time to get used to you," James replied, trying to defuse the situation. He bent down to take Andy in his arms and calm him. "I didn't raise you to be such a weak father," Margaret snapped, her voice full of authority. "In my day, you learned to be quiet and endure. You should teach him the same thing now." Sarah bit her lip, not daring to contradict her, although resentment was bubbling inside her. She took Andy upstairs, leaving the two in the living room. Upstairs, Andy was sitting on his mother's lap, still sniffing. "Grandma hurt me," he said softly, his small hands clutching Sarah's tightly. Sarah froze for a moment, but tried to keep her voice steady. "Grandma loves you, darling. I'm sure she didn't mean to hurt you," she said, though an uneasiness began to grow in her heart. What did Andy's words mean? Had Margaret really done something to scare him? "No, she doesn't love me," Andy said, shaking his head, his voice trembling. "She hurt my hand." Sarah took Andy's small hand and examined it, finding only a few faint red marks. "Did you fall or bump into something?" she asked, but Andy remained silent, his tear-filled eyes staring into space. Downstairs, James tried to reason with his mother. "Mother, maybe we should be gentler with Andy. He's just a little boy. Not everyone is like I was back then." Margaret let out a dry laugh. "You think I was wrong? I raised you to face life head-on. Without my discipline, you wouldn't have achieved what you have today." James fell silent, memories of his childhood resurfacing. However, it was Sarah who had grown up under the strict thumb of her own mother, Eleanor, a stern woman who believed that rigid discipline built character. Sarah had often told James about the long nights spent obeying strict rules, the scoldings for minor mistakes, and the time she had been deprived of freedom. These memories still weighed heavily on her. "But the cost was too high, Mother," James said calmly, thinking of Sarah's difficult childhood. "I don't want Andy to go through what Sarah endured." Margaret stared at him, her eyes full of displeasure. "What are you doing with your life, James? Have you forgotten what it means to be a father?" James wanted to argue further, but he just sighed and shook his head. He knew that no argument would change his mother's rigid mind. That night, Sarah told James what Andy had said. "What do you think Mother could have done to him?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. "I don't know," James replied, his voice heavy. "But I'm going to find out. If it's true, I won't let this continue." Sarah nodded, but her heart remained heavy. She knew that confronting Margaret would not be easy, but she would do anything to protect Andy, even if it meant standing up to the most authoritarian woman in the family. That night, the air in the house seemed thick with silence and tension. Andy, after crying for a long time, finally fell asleep in Sarah's arms. but his sleep was restless. He would often startle and cry out in his dreams, forcing James to wake up several times to check on him. "Sarah, he's having nightmares again," James said softly, standing at the door of Andy's room. The dim light from the nightlight revealed his anxious face. Sarah was sitting by her son's bed, gently stroking his hair. This time, he mentioned something about his grandmother. She whispered so as not to wake Andy. "I can't stop thinking about what he said earlier. James, we can't ignore this anymore." James sighed, running a hand through his hair to chase away his fatigue. "I know, but you know how my mother is. If we don't have concrete proof, she'll deny everything and accuse us of spoiling him." Sarah didn't answer, but her eyes were filled with determination. She knew that staying silent would only make things worse. Andy needed protection, and she was ready to do anything to ensure his safety. The next morning, Sarah received a call from Lisa, her best friend. Lisa was one of the few people Sarah confided in about her family problems. "Sarah, you look exhausted. Is everything okay?" Lisa asked, her voice full of concern, as they met in a small cafe near Sarah's house. Sarah sighed, stirring her coffee. "Lisa, I don't even know where to start. Lately, Andy has been terrified of his grandmother. He even screams in his sleep, saying she hurt him. I talked to James about it, but he's hesitant because Margaret is his mother." Lisa frowned, placing her hand on Sarah's. "Sarah, you have to do something. If Andy is saying these things, there's a reason. Don't let your respect for her overshadow your motherly instincts." Sarah nodded, a new resolve forming within her. "I know, but the problem is that Margaret has too much power in this family. I need proof, otherwise she'll dismiss everything I say." Meanwhile, at home, James sat in his office, lost in thought about what Sarah had said. He was flipping through an old family photo album, and images of Sarah's childhood resurfaced. She had told him how her mother, Eleanor, had raised her with strict discipline, forcing her to obey without question. Each photo seemed to rekindle Sarah's painful memories. One photo, in particular, caught James's attention. It showed Sarah as a child, sitting next to her mother, her eyes red and swollen with tears, but forced to smile for the camera. Sarah was just a child, and her mother wouldn't even forgive the smallest mistake, he thought bitterly. His eyes began to sting with tears. Sarah's memories had made him realize that he didn't want Andy to grow up in the same fear she had endured. The mix of anguish and responsibility weighed heavily on him, pushing him towards a decision. That afternoon, Margaret returned. As usual, she entered with an imposing air, her gaze scrutinizing everything around her. Andy immediately cowered, hiding behind Sarah and clinging tightly to her dress. "Andy, come greet your grandmother," Margaret ordered, her voice full of authority. Sarah knelt and spoke softly to her son. "Andy, I'm here, it's okay." But Andy just shook his head, his eyes red with tears. He didn't even dare to look in his grandmother's direction. "No, I don't want to," he cried, his voice trembling. Margaret frowned, approaching. "This boy needs discipline, Sarah. What are you doing letting him become so spoiled?" Sarah straightened up, meeting Margaret's cold gaze. "Mother, maybe you should leave him alone. He's still young, there's no need to force him." "Force him?" Margaret sneered. "Children like him must learn obedience. I raised James the same way, and now he's a successful man. Don't think your softness will help him grow." James, who was standing near the door, entered the room. "Mother, stop. Andy is not like me. I don't want him to endure what Sarah went through." Margaret turned sharply, looking at James as if he had just said something unthinkable. "Are you saying the way I raised your wife was wrong? Without discipline, she wouldn't be where she is today." "Yes, and I thank you for that. But that doesn't mean I have to do the same thing with my son," James replied firmly. "Mother, I want Andy to grow up in a safe and loving environment." Margaret remained silent, but her eyes burned with anger. "So you're opposing me now, aren't you, James? You've really changed." James sighed, but he didn't regret speaking up. He knew this was just the beginning of a battle, but for Andy's sake, he was ready to face whatever came. The atmosphere in the house became even more tense after the confrontation between James and Margaret. Andy still refused to leave his mother's side whenever his grandmother was around. His nightmares became more frequent, and Sarah found it increasingly difficult to ignore the troubling signs. One morning, while Andy was playing with a puzzle, Sarah noticed red marks on his wrist. They looked like the imprint of someone who had squeezed him too hard, leaving faint lines. "Andy, what happened here?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone calm. Andy flinched and pulled his hand away. Nothing, Mommy," he said, avoiding her gaze. Sarah didn't press, but her heart was heavy. After Andy's nap, she spoke to James about it. "I noticed red marks on Andy's wrist this morning. What do you think could have caused that?" Sarah asked, her voice low so Andy wouldn't hear. James leaned back on the sofa, rubbing his temples. "Maybe he was playing a little too rough." "Don't overthink it, Sarah. You don't find that alarming?" Sarah asked, unable to hide her frustration. "Our son is increasingly terrified of your mother. He's having constant nightmares, and now there are strange marks on his wrist. I don't think it's a coincidence." James was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I'll keep a closer eye on things. But you know my mother, she never admits when she's wrong. If we don't have concrete proof, confronting her will only make her angrier." Sarah pressed her lips together, knowing James was right. Margaret was a powerful and stubborn woman who had never acknowledged her mistakes. But despite the challenges, Sarah couldn't let this continue. She had to find a way to protect Andy. That afternoon, Sarah decided to speak to Ellen, the longtime housekeeper, hoping she might shed some light on the situation. In the kitchen, Ellen was preparing dinner, her kind face radiating concern as Sarah entered. "Ellen, do you have a moment to talk?" Sarah asked, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Of course, ma'am. What is it?" Ellen stopped her work and looked at Sarah with concern. Sarah hesitated for a moment before being direct. "Have you noticed anything unusual when my mother-in-law, Margaret, visits? I mean, the way she interacts with Andy." Ellen's expression darkened, and she sighed, putting down the knife she was holding. "Mrs. Sarah, I've worked for this family for a long time. When James was a child, Mrs. Margaret was already strict with him. But it was your mother, Eleanor, who was particularly hard on you. I witnessed times when her punishments were far from fair." "What do you mean?" Sarah pressed, her heart pounding. Ellen hesitated, then continued. "Eleanor believed that children needed discipline to grow up well. I remember once you spilled a glass of water on the table, and she made you stand for an entire evening. Other children in the family went through similar things. Many of them were so scared they wouldn't dare play when she was around." Sarah felt anger rising within her, rekindled by her own childhood memories. "So you think Margaret might be doing something to Andy now?" "I'm worried she's scaring him." Ellen looked at Sarah with sad eyes. "I'm not sure, but Mrs. Sarah, if you suspect something, you must protect Andy. I kept quiet back then because I was afraid of losing my job, but in hindsight, I wish I had spoken up to protect you." Sarah clenched her fists. Ellen's words were a shock, pushing her to act. That night, James couldn't sleep. Sarah's account of her conversation with Ellen revived the painful memories she had shared with him about her childhood under Eleanor's rule. These memories resurfaced like a flood, plunging him into a spiral of emotions. Sarah had told him how she had been forced to study to the point of exhaustion and the severe punishments for minor mistakes. Once, she had broken a plate while washing dishes and had to stand outside in the freezing cold of a winter night as punishment. Eleanor didn't see this as abuse, but as education. Yet, for Sarah, they were emotional scars that had never healed. James sat up, watching Sarah hold a sleeping Andy. The sight filled him with resolve. He could not let his son endure a childhood like Sarah's. The next day, Margaret returned, with her usual imposing presence and cold gaze. She settled into the living room armchair, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Andy. "Andy, come here and see your grandmother," Margaret ordered. Andy immediately backed away, hiding behind Sarah and clinging to her skirt. "No, I don't want to," he cried, tears streaming down his face. Margaret frowned and stood up, moving towards Andy. But this time, Sarah stood between her and her son. "Mother, please, don't force him. He's just a child." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression filled with indignation. "Sarah, You've spoiled him. Don't you understand that children need discipline? Sarah didn't back down. Discipline doesn't mean scaring him, Mother. What you're doing is hurting him. James entered the room and stood beside his wife. Mother, we need to talk. We don't want Andy to grow up in fear. Margaret turned to James, her eyes blazing with anger. You're opposing me, James? Are you teaching your son to be so weak? No, I'm teaching him to grow up with love, James replied, his voice calm but firm. I've had enough, and I don't want Andy to suffer like Sarah. Margaret fell silent, her face red with anger. But this time, James didn't flinch. He stood firmly, a shield for his son. After this second confrontation with Margaret, the tension in the house reached its peak. Andy became increasingly withdrawn and fearful whenever his grandmother was around. He stopped playing and laughing, instead clinging to his mother, his eyes wide with fear as soon as he saw Margaret's shadow. One afternoon, as Sarah was preparing dinner, Ellen called out to her in the kitchen. Mrs. Sarah, I don't think we can let things continue like this, Ellen said softly. Sarah turned to her, her eyes questioning. What do you mean? Ellen lowered her voice and glanced around, as if afraid someone would hear her. Yesterday, while I was in the garden, I heard Mrs. Margaret yelling at Andy. I think she grabbed his hand firmly because I heard him cry out right after. Sarah's heart sank. Are you sure, Ellen? Did you see anything? No, I didn't see clearly, but I heard enough to know that Andy was terrified, Ellen said, her voice trembling. You have to do something before things get worse. That night, James and Sarah had a serious discussion. Andy was asleep, but the quiet of the house did nothing to ease the tension in their hearts. Sarah, I've been thinking a lot, James began, his eyes heavy with worry. I can't stay silent anymore. If Mother is really doing something to Andy, we have to protect him. Sarah nodded, a glimmer of hope dawning in her. So what do we do? Confront her directly? No, talking won't be enough. Mother will never admit anything. I think the only way to find out the truth is to install cameras in the house, James said firmly. Sarah was surprised at first, but quickly realized it might be their only option. If that's what it takes to protect Andy, then I agree. The next morning, while Margaret was out, James pretended to leave for work, but instead went to a store to buy a hidden camera. He chose a discreet model that could be placed in the living room, where Margaret often interacted with Andy. Sarah helped him install the camera during lunch, while Ellen kept Andy busy in his room. James carefully adjusted the angle, making sure everything would be recorded clearly. Once they were finished, they sat down and exhaled deeply. I hope this gives us the answers we need, Sarah said, holding James's hand tightly. I hope so too, James replied, his eyes filled with determination. If Mother has done anything to hurt him, I will not forgive her. That afternoon, as usual, Margaret arrived at the house. She entered with her characteristic air of authority, unaware that her every move was now being recorded. Andy, come here and see your grandmother, Margaret said, her voice low but authoritarian. Andy immediately backed away, his fearful eyes turning to his mother. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah knelt and spoke softly to her son. It's okay, darling. I'm here. Margaret frowned and approached Andy. You've spoiled him too much, Sarah. A child so timid will never amount to anything. Sarah squeezed Andy's hand, her voice firm as she replied, Mother, I think today you should leave Andy alone. He's not used to being pushed around like this. Margaret said nothing, but her eyes were full of judgment. She sat down, pulling a book from her bag, feigning indifference. But a few minutes later, she spoke again, her voice sharper this time. Andy, come here. I don't have time to waste on your games. Sarah opened her mouth to intervene, but Andy suddenly started screaming, tears streaming down his cheeks. No, I don't want to. You're hurting me. The room fell silent. James, who was standing near the living room door, stepped forward, his expression darkening. Mother, I think you should stop, James said, his voice low but resolute. Andy is not a child you can impose yourself on like Eleanor did with Sarah. Margaret turned sharply, glaring at James. What are you saying? You think I'm doing something to him? I don't know, but it's clear that Andy is terrified of you, James replied, his tone calm but firm. I don't want this to continue. You need to leave him alone. Margaret let out a cold sneer and stood up. Who do you think you're to lecture me on how to raise my grandson? Without me, you would be nothing. Sarah took Andy's hand and led him gently upstairs, leaving the two facing each other in an intense silence. That night, James watched the first recording from the hidden camera. He opened his laptop, fast-forwarding the video to the moment Margaret approached Andy. The images were crystal clear. Margaret gripping Andy's hand tightly as he struggled, her face cold and her eyes filled with anger. You must learn to endure. Crying children are weak. Her voice boomed in the recording, making James's blood boil. Sarah, standing beside him, covered her mouth to stifle a gasp of shock. James, you see it now, don't you? We can't let this happen anymore. James nodded, his expression hardening with fury. Tomorrow, we will confront her. I will not forgive this. The next morning, a heavy tension hung in the house. James sat in the living room, his eyes fixed on the laptop on the table. The hidden camera video was paused, showing the moment Margaret grabbed Andy's hand, and her harsh words echoed in the recording. Beside him, Sarah clenched her hand, her face etched with worry. James, what are you going to do today? She asked, her voice trembling. I'm going to confront her. It's time she faced the consequences of her actions, James said, his voice low but resolute. Andy can't live in fear anymore. Sarah nodded, though unease gnawed at her. I'll be there to support you. We will protect Andy, no matter what. At the exact time, Margaret arrived, the sound of the heavy wooden door creaking as she entered. She displayed her usual imposing presence, her black cane tapping rhythmically on the tiled floor. Where is Andy? I want to talk to him, she demanded, skipping the greetings. Sarah stepped forward, blocking the entrance to the living room. Andy doesn't want to see you, Mother. He's resting. Margaret raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze piercing Sarah. You again, always protecting and coddling him. Don't you see you're hurting him by acting this way? Sarah clenched her fists, but her voice remained calm. Mother, protecting my son is not hurting him. It's what you are doing that is causing him pain. Before Margaret could respond, James came out of the living room, his laptop in hand. Mother, we need to talk. Margaret's face showed a flicker of irritation. Are you here to preach to me again? If so, spare me. I know what I'm doing. James shook his head, placing the laptop on the table. I don't want to argue, Mother, but there's something you need to see. He played the hidden camera video, turning the screen so Margaret could see it clearly. The images and sound unfolded unmistakably. Andy screaming, his small hands trying to break free from his grandmother's firm grip, and Margaret's cold, authoritarian voice. You must learn to endure. Crying children are weak. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Margaret stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the screen. When the video ended, she turned to James, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. Was this your idea? You installed cameras in the house to spy on me. Margaret roared, her voice full of authority. Yes, I did, James replied, his voice firm but unyielding. Because I had to protect Andy. Don't you see that your actions are scaring him? Don't lecture me about protection. Margaret shouted, her eyes blazing. I raised you to be the man you are today. Without me, you would be nothing. James clenched his fists, his voice turning to a sinister tone. Have you ever thought about what your generation's methods did to Sarah? The fear, the pressure, and the scars she had to hide throughout her childhood. Did you ever ask me how she felt? Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but James didn't let her. And now, you're doing the same thing to Andy. I will not allow it. I will not let you hurt my son. Sarah, standing behind them, felt the heat of the confrontation between the two. She brought Andy down and gently placed him on the sofa. Andy, tell Daddy what Grandma did, she encouraged him softly. Andy looked around, his tear-filled eyes darting nervous glances. At first, he was silent, but when James knelt before him, holding his hands, he trembled and said, Grandma hurt my hand. She squeezed it tight. I was scared. His soft but truthful words cut through the tense atmosphere like a blade. James turned to face his mother, looking her straight in the eye. Did you hear that, Mother? That's how he feels. That's why I can't stay silent. Margaret, for once, seemed to falter. She took a step back, her face pale. But then, she tried to regain her usual demeanor. Children always exaggerate. Are you seriously taking a child's word against mine? James stood up, his eyes burning with anger, but also filled with determination. Yes, I will, because I'm Andy's father, and I will protect him at all costs. The confrontation ended in a heavy silence. Margaret said nothing more as she left the house, her wooden cane striking the floor forcefully, as if to release her anger. Sarah hugged Andy tightly, while James collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "Did we do the right thing?" James asked, his voice choked. Sarah placed a hand on her husband's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "Right or wrong doesn't matter, James. What matters is that we stood up for our son." James looked up, his eyes filled with emotion. "I swear to you, Sarah, I will never let anyone hurt Andy again." Sarah nodded, a sense of fierce conviction rising within her. They both knew this was just the beginning of a long battle, but they were ready to face whatever came to protect their family. After Margaret left, silence returned to the room, but no one felt at ease. James sat quietly on the sofa, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Andy sat on Sarah's lap, snuggling into his mother's arms for comfort. Sarah gently stroked her son's hair, her worried eyes fixed on her husband. "James, are you okay?" she asked softly. James nodded, though his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. "I'm fine, Sarah, but I need time to think. We need to decide our next steps carefully." The next morning, while Sarah took Andy to Lisa's to give him a temporary break from the tense atmosphere at home, James spent his time reviewing all the footage captured by the hidden camera. Every second that passed only fueled his growing anger and helplessness. In another clip, he saw Margaret not only gripping Andy's hand tightly, but also shouting at him, causing him to burst into tears. "You think you can do anything if you don't learn to be strong? Crying won't get you anywhere." Margaret's cold, harsh words echoed in the video, and James's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. When Sarah returned home, James was ready. He placed his hand on her shoulder, his gaze resolute. "We have to settle this, Sarah. Not just for Andy, but for ourselves." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "What do you plan to do?" "We're going to confront her in front of the whole family. Everyone needs to know the truth. This isn't just our problem anymore." That afternoon, James gathered the family. Besides Sarah and Andy, his brother Michael and his wife Sophia arrived. Ellen was also present, sitting quietly in a corner, her eyes filled with visible concern. When everyone was gathered, Margaret entered. She scanned the room, sensing the unusual atmosphere. "Why have you gathered everyone here? What's going on?" she asked in a stern tone. James stood up, his hand resting on the laptop ready on the table. "Mother, today I want everyone to see what you have done. This can no longer remain hidden." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her sharp eyes fixed on James. "Are you accusing me of some nonsense again?" Without answering, James once again played the video captured by the hidden camera. The images and sound filled the room. Margaret gripping Andy's hand, her harsh voice reprimanding him, and the sound of his sobs. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the audio from the video. Michael, who had been silent until then, frowned and turned to their mother. "Mother, is this true? Did you really do this to your grandson?" Margaret didn't answer immediately, but her face went from pale to red with anger. "You're all ganging up on me, aren't you? This is just a childish exaggeration. I was only trying to teach him the right thing." Sarah could no longer hold back. "You think squeezing a child's hand so hard he screams is right? You think throwing insults at him and forcing him to obey is the best way to educate him?" Michael spoke up, his voice filled with frustration. "Mother, our nephew is only 3 years old. This is not how a grandmother should treat her grandson. You need to understand that your actions are wrong." Margaret let out a dry laugh, but it was filled with anger. "You think you're qualified to judge me? I raised you all. I gave you everything you have. Without me, you would be nothing." James stepped forward, standing in front of his mother. "We are grateful for what you have done, Mother, but that doesn't justify the harm you have caused. And now, I will not let you hurt Andy. This has to stop. The argument continued, but in the end, Margaret could not deny the evidence. Without another word, she left the house, her expression a mix of anger and defeat. Michael and Sophia, though shaken, expressed their support for James and Sarah in their protection of Andy. That night, James and Sarah sat together in the living room. Andy was sleeping peacefully upstairs, his nightmares no longer bothering him. "James, how do you think this will end?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but full of worry. "I don't know, Sarah, but at least we did what was right. I don't regret standing up to her," James replied, his eyes filled with determination. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, a sense of relief washing over her for the first time in days. Though they knew the road ahead was not over, they were convinced they were on the right path. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, James and Sarah sat together at the breakfast table. The laptop with the video evidence rested on the table, and James's phone was next to it. Andy was still asleep, his face relaxed after a peaceful night. "James, what do you think we should do today?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but full of determination. "We have no other choice," James replied, his eyes reflecting an unwavering resolve. "I'm going to call the police and report everything. Mother must be held accountable." Sarah nodded. She knew this decision would likely worsen the tensions within the family, but it was the only way to protect Andy. "Are you sure?" she asked one last time, making sure they were both ready for what was to come. James placed a hand gently on his wife's shoulder, his gaze both tender and firm. "I'm sure. We are doing this not only for Andy, but to prevent her from harming anyone else." Picking up his phone, James dialed the emergency number and waited for the line to connect. A professional and calm female voice answered on the other end. "This is 911. How can I help you?" "Hello, I need to report a serious case of child abuse," James said, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "I have clear evidence and need to meet with law enforcement to provide more information." The dispatcher asked him a few follow-up questions to confirm the details and advised him to stay at home. A police team would be dispatched to handle the situation. James ended the call and turned to Sarah. "They will be here in 30 minutes. Sarah nodded, a mix of anxiety and hope rising within her. "We need to get everything ready. Andy is still asleep, so I'll take him Elise's when the police arrive to keep him away from any stress." "That's a good idea. I'll stay here to explain everything and hand over the video," James said, gripping the laptop firmly as if making a silent vow to protect his family. At the exact time, a white police car pulled up in front of the house. Two officers got out, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor and a younger woman with a friendlier appearance. They knocked on the door, and James quickly let them in. "Hello, I'm Officer Martinez, and this is my colleague, Officer Laura," the man said, showing his badge. "We received your report. May we come in?" "Of course, please come in," James replied, leading them to the living room. Sarah, standing nearby, gave a polite nod to the officers before taking Andy out of the house to avoid exposing him to further tension. Once everyone was seated, James began to recount the entire story, from Andy's unusual behavior to Margaret's alarming actions that he and Sarah had discovered. He opened the laptop and showed the video to the officers. Officer Martinez frowned as he watched, while Laura sighed softly, her expression empathetic. "This is very clear evidence," Laura said, looking at James. "This behavior is unacceptable. We will begin an investigation immediately." "What will you do next?" James asked, his voice full of concern. "We will summon Margaret for questioning," Martinez said firmly. "We will also run a background check on her to see if there have been any other allegations against her." When Sarah returned after leaving Andy with Lisa, she found James sitting with the officers, his face still tense. She approached and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Is everything okay?" James nodded, turning to look at his wife. "They are starting the investigation. I provided the video and all the necessary information." Laura offered a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, ma'am. We will handle this case with the seriousness it deserves. However, we will need your statements and Ellen's, as she witnessed some of the incidents." Sarah nodded. "I'm willing to cooperate. As for Ellen, I'll talk to her and convince her to help. The next day, James, Sarah, and Ellen went to the police station to give detailed statements. Ellen seemed hesitant at first, but seeing the determination in James and Sarah's eyes, she realized she could no longer remain silent. "I have worked for this family for many years," Ellen began, her voice slightly trembling. "I have seen Mrs. Margaret be very strict with the children in the family. But it was Sarah's mother, Eleanor, who was particularly hard on her. She always believed that discipline was the only way to teach, but sometimes she went too far. I think it's time for the truth to come out." Laura listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally looking up at Ellen. "What you are sharing is very important. You did the right thing by supporting this family." As the group left the police station, James felt a small sense of relief. Though he knew the investigation might take time, he also recognized the progress they were making. Holding Sarah's hand as he stepped out into the sunlight, he felt a renewed sense of determination. "Sarah, I think we've taken the first step," James said, his voice calmer than it had been in days. "We didn't stay silent, and that's what matters." Sarah smiled and squeezed his hand. "That's right. Andy deserves to grow up in a safe and happy environment. I believe things will turn out well." The following day, Margaret received a summons from the police station. The news spread quickly through the family, creating a wave of shock and concern. Michael and Sophia, James's brother and sister-in-law, were stunned when they heard. "Do you think it's true?" Sophia asked her husband as they drove to James's house. Michael sighed, his expression heavy with concern. "If James has brought this to light, there must be a reason. I don't think my brother would act without a solid basis." When they arrived at James's house, they saw him with Sarah sitting in the living room with Ellen. Andy was playing with a toy Lisa had brought as a gift. Although the little boy's face seemed brighter, there was still a hint of hesitation whenever his grandmother was mentioned. "James, did you really do this?" Michael asked as soon as he entered, his voice full of concern. James nodded, his eyes resolute. "Yes, Michael. I had no other choice. We cannot stay silent when a child is being harmed." Sophia sat next to Sarah, her expression full of empathy. "Sarah, I understand how you feel. As mothers, all we want is to protect our children. But I'm afraid this will fracture the family." Sarah met Sophia's gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "Sophia, I understand. But the most important thing right now is Andy. I can't let him live in fear for another day." Meanwhile, at the police station, Margaret sat in the interrogation room, facing Officers Martinez and Laura. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes betrayed a deep irritation. "Mrs. Margaret, we have received reports about your behavior towards your grandson, Andy. We also have video evidence. Do you have anything to say?" Martinez asked, his tone even but sharp. Margaret straightened up, her eyes shining with pride. "I have done nothing wrong. This is just traditional discipline. You wouldn't understand." Laura, who usually maintained a gentle demeanor, couldn't hide the firmness in her voice this time. "Mrs. Margaret, this isn't about parenting styles. This is about actions that have caused physical and emotional harm to a 3-year-old child. We need a clear answer from you." Margaret remained silent, her fists clenched. For the first time in her life, the woman who had always prided herself on her authority and control felt cornered. Back at James's house, as the family discussed the situation, James's phone rang. Seeing Officer Laura's name on the screen, he answered quickly. "Hello, this is James," he said, his voice laced with tension. "James, I'm calling to update you. We have interrogated Mrs. Margaret. She denies all accusations and insists that this is just her method of discipline," Laura said from the other end. "She refuses to admit anything?" James asked, his brow furrowed. "That's correct," Laura replied, her tone softening. "But the video evidence is very convincing. We will continue to investigate and will contact you if we need more information." James thanked her and turned to Sarah and Michael. Mother still denies everything. She claims it's all part of her way of teaching. Michael sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That's how she's always been. She never admits she's wrong." "But, James, you're doing the right thing. Don't be discouraged." That evening, after Andy had gone to bed, James and Sarah sat together in the living room. Ellen had gone home, and Michael and Sophia had left after a long day. "James, how long do you think this will take?" Sarah asked softly, her voice tinged with worry. "I don't know, Sarah, but I believe the truth will come out." "Mother won't be able to avoid it forever," James replied, placing his hand on hers reassuringly. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, finding a moment of peace. "No matter how this ends, I'm relieved to know we did everything we could to protect Andy. He deserves a happy childhood." James nodded, his expression firm. "Absolutely. From now on, I won't let anyone hurt him." The next day, Lisa visited the house to check on Sarah and Andy. Upon hearing the whole story, Lisa couldn't hide her emotions. "Sarah, you have been incredibly brave. Not everyone would have the courage to stand up to someone like Margaret." Sarah smiled and hugged Lisa. "We had no choice, Lisa. I'm just doing what any mother would do." Lisa looked at Andy, who was playing with her daughter. "Andy looks happier now. He will heal, Sarah. It just takes time and love." That night, as James and Sarah were getting ready for bed, James's phone rang again. This time, it was Martinez. "James, I wanted to inform you that we have just received another complaint from a different family member. It seems Mrs. Margaret's behavior wasn't limited to Andy. There are allegations of harm to other children in the past," Martinez said. James sat up straight, his heart pounding. "Thank you, Martinez. This is incredibly important. I will do everything I can to help." Hanging up, James turned to Sarah. "This isn't over yet, but I think justice is getting closer." The next morning, James and Sarah received a call from the police station, asking them to come in for an update on the case. After leaving Andy with Lisa, they went to the station, emotions swirling, both anxious and hopeful. At the station, they were led to a small conference room where Officers Martinez and Laura were waiting. Martinez spoke, his tone calm but firm. "We have gathered enough evidence to bring Mrs. Margaret to justice. In addition to the video you provided, we have also received testimony from other family members." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Other family members? Who?" Laura offered a slight smile as she answered. "One of them is Mrs. Margaret's eldest granddaughter, Abigail. She came forward to share her own experiences of similar treatment when she was younger. She decided to speak up after learning what Andy had endured." James squeezed Sarah's hand tightly, his eyes filled with emotion. "This is what we were hoping for. The truth is coming out." Martinez nodded and continued. "We are finalizing the case and will submit it to the court in the coming days. But this isn't just about the legal process. It's an opportunity for your family to confront the past and rebuild trust." Sarah felt a weight lift slightly from her shoulders. "Thank you for working tirelessly to help our family. This means so much to us." Laura smiled warmly, her sincerity evident. "It's our duty, and I believe that with love and determination, your family will overcome this ordeal." Back home, James and Sarah sat in the living room, reflecting on what they had just learned. "What do you think we should do next?" Sarah asked softly. "We need to talk to the rest of the family. This is no longer just our problem," James said, his expression thoughtful. That evening, James called Michael, Sophia, and Abigail to invite them to discuss the situation. When Abigail arrived, she looked around the living room, her emotions evident. "Abigail, it was very brave of you to speak up," James said, pulling a chair for her. Abigail offered a slight smile, her gaze landing on Andy playing in a corner. "I couldn't stay silent anymore, James. When I learned what Andy had endured, I knew I had to do something." Michael placed a reassuring hand on Abigail's shoulder, his voice calm. "You did the right thing. It's time now for our family to come together to protect the children." In the days that followed, the family began to take steps towards healing. Andy was taken to a child psychologist who worked with him gently and patiently. Sarah sat by his side during the sessions, holding her son's hand as if to give him strength. "Andy is a bright and sensitive child," the psychologist said after the first session. "With your love and patience, he will recover from this ordeal." Sarah felt a spark of hope. "We will do whatever it takes to help Andy heal and live a happy life." Meanwhile, James focused on resolving the unresolved issues within the family. He took the initiative to meet Margaret at her home, where the older woman now lived in apparent seclusion. The allegations and the family's estrangement had taken a toll on her. "Mother, I didn't come here to accuse you again," James began, his voice calm. "I came because I want you to understand the impact your actions have had on this family." Margaret looked at her son, her eyes tired and weary in a way James had never seen before. "James, I did everything for you. I never thought I was wrong." "Mother, love is not about control or coercion. Love is about understanding and protecting. You made mistakes, but it's not too late to fix things," James said, his voice filled with sincerity. Margaret remained silent, her head bowed as if lost in thought. For the first time, she did not challenge her son's words. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the family warmed. Andy gradually regained his radiant smile. He ran through the house, laughing and playing with his friends, no longer burdened by fear. Sarah and James felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from their shoulders. One afternoon, as Andy was playing in the garden, James sat next to Sarah on a stone bench. He held her hand, his gaze filled with contentment. "Sarah, we did it. Andy is healing, and our family is moving forward." Sarah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's true, James. The most important thing is that we didn't stay silent. Love carried us through it all." The story culminated in a large family gathering. Michael, Sophia, Abigail, and other relatives came to James's house to celebrate Andy's recovery and the newfound unity within the family. Margaret was also present, but this time she behaved differently. The arrogance and coldness she once exuded were gone. As the celebration came to a close, Margaret stood up and addressed the gathering. "I've thought a lot about all of this," she began, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I was wrong, and I want to apologize to all of you, especially to Andy." The room fell silent until Abigail stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, grandmother. As long as you understand and change, we are still a family." James and Sarah exchanged a look, their eyes filled with peace and satisfaction. Love had triumphed, bringing hope and healing to everyone involved. This story imparts a profound lesson about love and protection, as James and Sarah prioritized Andy's safety above all family pressures. It encourages the courage to speak out against injustice, even when it means confronting one's own parents. The repercussions of Margaret's severe methods underscore the importance of empathy and love in raising children. The unity shown by Abigail and Michael demonstrates that families can overcome adversity when they stand together. Ultimately, remorse and forgiveness open the door to healing, allowing trust and family bonds to be rebuilt. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing you moving stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.